In the quiet halls of an elite school in China, a dark secret festered, one that would lead an 18-year-old student to take matters into her own hands. Betrayed by 5 teachers who had once taken advantage of her, Liu Xiaodan's revenge would not only shatter their lives, but expose a chilling conspiracy that no one could have anticipated. Liu Xiaodan had always been a quiet girl. She wasn't the type to stand out in a crowd, nor was she someone who went out of her way to make friends. At 18, she was just another student in the halls of Qinyang High School in Henan, China. Her grades were average, her home life was unremarkable, and she had no history of trouble. Teachers barely noticed her, and classmates rarely spoke to her unless necessary. That changed in the winter of 2023. Rumors began circulating about her relationship with several male teachers. It started with whispers in the school corridors, exchanged in hushed voices when teachers walked by. Some students claimed to have seen her in situations that were far from appropriate. Others dismissed it as gossip, the kind that always floated around before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. But as the weeks passed, the rumors didn't fade. Liu wasn't from a privileged background. Her mother worked at a garment factory, often returning home past midnight, exhausted and barely able to stay awake for dinner. Her father had left when she was 9, moving to another city to start a new life. She had no siblings. In many ways, she had always been alone. That loneliness made her an easy target. One of her teachers, Mr. Zhang, had been the first to notice her silence, the way she never met anyone's eyes. He was in his late 40s, a man known for his stern demeanor and strict grading. But behind closed doors, he had a different reputation. He had been seen lingering around female students, offering them extra lessons after school. Nothing was ever proven, though complaints had been whispered to the administration before. It started with a simple request. He asked Liu to stay after class, saying he noticed she had fallen behind in her studies. She agreed, knowing that saying no wasn't an option. When the classroom emptied and the doors locked, he moved closer than he needed to. She didn't resist, she didn't speak. She let it happen. What followed was something that repeated itself with 4 other teachers over the next few months. Each one had their own method of luring her in. Mr. Chen, the youngest of them, used compliments. Mr. Wu relied on threats, low grades, disciplinary actions. Mr. Li, the principal, had power on his side. And Mr. Huang, the biology teacher, simply took advantage of an opportunity. She never told anyone. She never fought back. To the outside world, nothing changed, but something had. In early 2024, Liu received a message from an anonymous number. The words were simple. You should get tested. She ignored it at first. It could have been a prank, one of the many cruel jokes her classmates played. But when she received another text the following week, she decided to go to a clinic in the city. It was a cold morning in January when she sat in a small, sterile room waiting for the results. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. He told her the truth in blunt words. She had HIV. She didn't cry. She didn't ask how or why. She already knew. Liu wasn't naive. She had read about the disease, knew how it spread. The realization hit her in a way that no words could describe. 5 men, 5 trusted figures in her life had done this to her. She walked out of the clinic that day feeling something she had never felt before. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. That night, she didn't sleep. By the next morning, she had made her decision. She knew the schedules of each of them. She knew their habits, their weaknesses. She understood how easily they could be manipulated, the same way they had manipulated her. They had never thought of her as a threat. That was their mistake. The plan took weeks to set in motion. She made sure she was careful, that there were no suspicions. One by one, she approached them. Mr. Zhang was first. He was always eager, always willing. He didn't ask questions. Neither did Mr. Wu or Mr. Li. They believed they were in control. They had no idea. It wasn't until March that the first of them started showing symptoms. Mr. Zhang was the first to fall sick. He went to the hospital after weeks of unexplained fatigue, weight loss, and fever. The diagnosis was confirmed within days. The news spread quickly among the teachers, though no one spoke about it openly. When Mr. Wu was hospitalized a few weeks later with similar symptoms, people started whispering. By the time April came, 3 more teachers had been diagnosed. The administration tried to keep it quiet, but in a school full of teenagers, secrets didn't last long. Liu watched it all unfold from a distance. She listened as students speculated, as parents expressed concern. The teachers who had once walked with authority now looked hollow, their faces pale, their bodies frail. She never spoke a word about it. By May, 2 of them had resigned. The others took extended medical leave. The school avoided addressing the situation directly, instead focusing on damage control. Parents demanded answers. Some pulled their children out of school. Investigations were launched, but there were no clear links, no evidence. No one suspected Liu. Why would they? She was just an ordinary girl. The last time she saw Mr. Zhang was in June. He was leaving the hospital, his body thinner than she remembered. He didn't recognize her at first. When he did, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear? Confusion? Maybe realization? She smiled at him before walking away. Liu didn't stay in Qinyang much longer after that. She packed her things and moved to Guangzhou, where no one knew her name, where she could start over. She left behind the school, the teachers, the whispers. But the story didn't die. It followed her, spreading in different versions, exaggerated and distorted. Some said she had infected dozens of men. Others claimed she had left a confession letter behind. None of them knew the truth. Liu never spoke about it again. She didn't have to. The city of Guangzhou was different from Qinyang. It was bigger, faster, louder. People moved with purpose, rushing through crowded streets without a second glance at those around them. Liu Xiaodan liked that. She liked being invisible. In a place like this, no one asked questions. No one cared about her past. She found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood near the Pearl River. It wasn't much. A single room with a bed, a desk, and a tiny bathroom. But it was hers. She paid for it using the money she had saved from odd jobs back in Qinyang. It wouldn't last forever, but she wasn't worried about that yet. Days turned into weeks, and she settled into a routine. She spent her mornings in coffee shops, scrolling through job listings on her phone. Afternoons were spent walking through the city, exploring narrow alleyways and crowded markets. Nights were the hardest. The silence in her room felt heavier than it should have. Sometimes she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, remembering. She never thought about them with guilt. She didn't regret what she had done. If anything, she wished she had done more. The 5 of them had stolen something from her, her innocence, her trust, her future. What she had given them in return was fair. She checked the news from Qinyang occasionally, searching for updates. There wasn't much. The school had issued a vague statement about the teachers resigning for personal reasons. No official mention of illness. No acknowledgement of the rumors that had spread through the town. It didn't matter. The truth was already out. One evening in July, she received a message from an unknown number. The words made her pause. "I know what you did." She stared at the screen for a long time. There was no name, no context, just those 5 words. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't respond. Instead, she deleted the message and turned off her phone. She told herself it was nothing. A prank. Someone from Qinyang tried to scare her. She wouldn't let it bother her. But the messages didn't stop. A few days later, another one appeared. "You think no one noticed?" Then another. "You can't hide forever." Liu felt a chill crawl up her spine. She started checking over her shoulder when she walked through the city. Every time her phone vibrated, her heart pounded. She told herself it was paranoia. No one knew. No one could possibly know. Then, in early August, an envelope appeared under her apartment door. She picked it up cautiously, her hands trembling. The paper was thin, the edges slightly crumpled. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of her, taken recently. She was walking through a market, a plastic bag in one hand, her gaze lowered. Someone had been watching her. Someone had followed her. Liu locked the door, pulling the curtains shut. For the first time in months, she felt fear. Real fear. She tried to push it aside. Whoever was behind this was just trying to scare her. They had nothing. They were grasping at shadows. But the messages kept coming. Did you think they wouldn't talk? You left a trail. You're not as careful as you think. She barely left her apartment after that. She ordered food online and kept the lights off at night. Every sound outside made her heart race. Every knock on the door made her freeze. Then, one night, someone knocked 3 times. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. The knocking came again. Then, silence. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. She didn't check. When she finally opened the door, there was no one there. Just another envelope on the floor. Inside, another photograph. This time, it wasn't her. It was Mr. Zhang. He was in a hospital bed. Tubes in his arms, his skin pale and sunken. His eyes stared straight ahead, hollow and empty. Liu clenched her fists. This was someone's way of taunting her, reminding her. But it didn't matter. What was done was done. The next morning, she packed her bags. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew she couldn't stay. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't going to stop. Are you enjoying the documentary? Hit the subscribe button to stay updated with our newest stories. She stepped outside for the first time in days, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The city was awake, people moving past her in all directions. She felt small in the crowd, lost. But maybe that was a good thing. Then, just as she turned the corner, she saw him, a man, standing across the street. He was wearing a dark jacket, a cap pulled low over his face. But she recognized him immediately. Mr. Wu, he was watching her. She took a step back. Her pulse pounded in her ears. He didn't move. Then, slowly, he smiled. Liu turned and ran. Liu Xiaodang ran without looking back, but she knew what she saw. He was alive, standing right there on that street, staring at her as if he had been waiting. The train doors closed, and she tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. He was supposed to be dying. She had seen his condition in the photographs, heard the rumors about his failing health. How was he here, looking stronger than before? She got off at a random station and walked through the exit, trying to steady her thoughts. If he had survived, had the others as well? She hadn't checked since leaving Qinyang. She assumed their conditions had worsened. She assumed they had faded away quietly. The way diseases like this often took people. She pulled out her phone and searched for updates. There was almost nothing. The school had erased nearly all traces of the scandal, keeping any news about the teachers away from public attention. But after digging deeper, she found a small article from a local news site, dated 2 weeks earlier. It mentioned the sudden improvement in the conditions of 2 former teachers of Qinyang High. Both had been undergoing treatment at a private medical facility. Their names weren't listed, but she didn't need confirmation. Mr. Wu was one of them. Her stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. The infection had no cure, no sudden reversal. How had they recovered? She turned off her phone and kept walking. There were too many questions, and none of them had answers. But one thing was clear. If Mr. Wu had found her, the others might not be far behind. She decided against going back to her apartment. Instead, she checked into a small motel on the other side of the city. The room was small and plain, but it was safe. She locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. The exhaustion of the day caught up to her, but she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. That smile, that look that said he knew everything. The next morning, she left the motel early, keeping her hood up as she walked. She needed to know more. She headed to a nearby internet cafe and logged into a new account to dig further into medical reports from the region. There were no official records of advanced treatments or experimental drugs being used in Henan. Whatever had happened to them wasn't documented. Then she found something strange. A clinic had been mentioned in passing in a medical journal, a facility known for unapproved treatments and discreet procedures. It had been linked to high-ranking officials and cases that never made it into public records. The location was just outside Qinyang. Her chest tightened at the thought of going back. But she couldn't ignore it. She needed to know the truth. By noon, she was on a train heading west. She kept her head down, hands tucked into her pockets. The journey felt longer than she remembered. Every stop made her anxious. Every glance from a stranger felt like a threat. When she arrived, the town looked the same. The streets were familiar. The the air thick with the scent of street food and exhaust. But she wasn't here to reminisce. She took a taxi to the outskirts, watching the familiar landmarks pass by. The clinic was hidden behind high walls, with security cameras at every corner. It didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a place where people went when they didn't want to be found. She stayed across the street, waiting. People came and went, none of them looking sick. Then, after nearly 2 hours, a car pulled up. Mr. Lee stepped out. She gripped the edge of the bench she was sitting on. He looked healthy. Too healthy. He entered the building, and she made her move. Circling the block, she found an alley that led to the back of the property. There was a locked gate, but the fence wasn't impossible to climb. She waited for a moment when no one was looking, then pulled herself up and over. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. She kept close to the walls, moving quickly past windows covered with thick blinds. The side entrance was unlocked. Slipping inside, she found herself in a narrow hallway. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sterile glow over the tiled floor. She moved cautiously, listening for any movement. She passed closed doors with no labels. No signs of patients, no sounds of machines beeping, just silence. Then, footsteps. She ducked into the nearest room and pressed herself against the wall. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped right outside the door. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She held her breath, waiting. Then, a voice. A familiar one? Mr. Zhang. She couldn't make out his words, but she recognized his tone. The same commanding voice that had once told her to stay after class, to do as she was told. Her fists clenched. The door didn't open. Instead, the footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. She exhaled slowly and stepped back into the corridor. She needed proof, something to show what was happening here. Further down, she found an office with the door slightly ajar. Inside, shelves lined with files and locked cabinets filled the space. A computer sat on a desk, the screen glowing softly. She hurried inside and searched through the files. Most of them were medical records, but nothing stood out. Then she opened a drawer and found a stack of patient reports. 5 names, all 5 of them. Next to their names, a single word was stamped in red ink. Treated. Her breath caught in her throat. They had been cured. But how? A rustling sound came from behind her. She turned. Mr. Zhang stood in the doorway. His lips curled into a smirk. He had been waiting for her. Liu Xiaodan's pulse pounded in her ears. Mr. Zhang stood in the doorway, arms crossed, blocking the exit. His expression was unreadable, but she knew why he was there. He had expected her to come. She gripped the files in her hands, willing herself to stay calm. She had come looking for answers, and now she had them. Whatever had been done to them in this facility had worked. They were cured. But it wasn't supposed to be possible. Mr. Zhang stepped forward. She took a step back, glancing toward the desk. There was a letter opener within reach. A small object, but sharp. If it came to it, she would fight. But he didn't move aggressively. Instead, he reached into his pocket and tossed something onto the desk. A single photograph. She didn't want to look. But her gaze fell on it anyway. It was a picture of her, taken that very morning. They had been watching her, tracking her movements. She hadn't been careful enough. Mr. Zhang said something, his voice low. She understood immediately. He wasn't here to hurt her. Not yet. He wanted to talk. He wanted her to listen. Liu didn't respond. She knew how this worked. He wanted control. He wanted her to be afraid. She took a slow breath, setting the files down on the desk. If she panicked, she would lose. Mr. Zhang walked to a cabinet and pulled out a folder. He flipped it open, showing her a page filled with medical data. A file on herself. They knew everything. Her medical history, her time in the hospital, the exact moment she was diagnosed, even the clinic in Guangzhou where she had gone for checkups. They had been following her long before she even knew it. She clenched her fists. There was no way out of this without understanding what they wanted. Mr. Zhang pointed to a section of the report. She leaned in slightly, eyes scanning the page. Her name was there, along with something she didn't expect, a result she had never seen before. The words stared back at her. Viral load. Undetectable. She stepped back. It didn't make sense. She had never undergone any treatment beyond the standard medication. There was no reason for this. Mr. Jiang smirked, as if he had been waiting for her to realize it. Liu gritted her teeth. Whatever had been done to them, they had done it to her too. Without her knowledge, without consent. She thought back to her last visit to the hospital months ago, when they had taken extra blood samples, saying it was for routine analysis. The nurse had been kind, too kind. She had suspected nothing. Her stomach turned. Mr. Jiang pulled another file from the cabinet and placed it beside hers. This one belonged to Mr. Wu. She skimmed through it, and her breath caught in her throat. The same result, undetectable. They hadn't just treated them, they had used her. Liu looked up at Mr. Jiang, the realization hitting her all at once. They had known about her condition from the beginning. They had planned for this. She had been nothing more than a subject in an experiment she hadn't agreed to. Her mind raced. If they had cured themselves, what else were they doing here? Were there others like her? Others they had used? Mr. Jiang leaned forward, lowering his voice. He wasn't gloating. He was giving her a choice. She could stay quiet. Walk away. Let this place remain a secret. Or she could expose it. But she knew what that meant. If she left with this knowledge, she wouldn't be safe. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. She had spent years being powerless. First in that school, then after, when the illness took over her life. But this time was different. This time she had a say. Slowly, she reached for the files. Mr. Jiang didn't stop her. She tucked them into her bag, adjusting the strap over her shoulder. Then, without another word, she walked past him and out the door. She kept her pace steady as she made her way through the hall, down the stairs, out the back entrance. The air outside felt thick, heavy with the weight of what she had just learned. No alarm sounded, no one stopped her, but she knew this wasn't over. She left the facility behind, stepping into the waiting taxi. The driver barely looked at her as he pulled away from the curb. She stared out the window, watching the buildings blur past. She had the truth now, and she wasn't going to run anymore. Liu Xiaodan sat in silence as the taxi sped away from the facility, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag. Inside, the stolen files felt heavier than paper, heavier than truth. They carried evidence of something far worse than what had happened to her in that school. The realization settled deep in her chest. This was never about revenge. It had never been about making them suffer the way they had made her suffer. They had turned her into something more than a victim. They had used her body without her knowledge, without her consent, to cure themselves. She thought about the moment she had decided to infect them. The anger, the pain, the need to reclaim even a small piece of power. And now, all of it felt meaningless. She had never been in control. Not then, and not now. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, exhaling slowly. The taxi turned onto the main road, the city lights flickering in the distance. She had a decision to make. If she exposed the facility, she wouldn't just be bringing down the teachers. The people who had done this, who had experimented on her, were far more powerful. This wasn't just about 5 men who had ruined her life. This was something bigger. She opened the bag and pulled out one of the documents, scanning the names. There were more, dozens of others. Some had been treated successfully, others were still in the process. She recognized a few names. Government officials, wealthy businessmen. If this secret got out, it wouldn't be just her life on the line. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She quickly stuffed the files back into her bag and looked away. She needed time to think, time to plan. She couldn't go back to her apartment, not after what she had seen. They would be watching. They had always been watching. Instead, she asked the driver to take her to the train station. The city passed by in a blur as she tried to piece everything together. The school had covered up the scandal. The teachers had disappeared from the public eye, and now she knew why. They had been protected, saved by something that wasn't supposed to exist. She thought about what she had done to them. Had they known all along? Had they been confident that they would survive? Or had they truly believed they were dying, only to be saved by some secret cure? The taxi pulled up to the station. She paid in cash, keeping her hood low as she stepped onto the platform. A train was already boarding. She didn't check the destination. It didn't matter where she went, only that she kept moving. As the train rumbled to life, she stared at the bag on her lap. She had spent years feeling powerless. But now, for the first time, she held something valuable, a secret people would kill to protect. She had no doubt they would come for her, but she wouldn't make it easy. The case of Liu Xiaodan, the 18-year-old high school student who sought revenge on the 5 teachers who exploited her, is one that highlights the dark underbelly of systemic abuse and manipulation. The shocking events that unfolded in the quiet corners of an elite school exposed not just the actions of a few corrupt individuals, but a deeply disturbing network of power, control, and secrecy. Xiaodan, driven by the pain of years of exploitation, resorted to a dangerous form of retaliation, an act that would alter the lives of the 5 teachers forever. What began as an act of revenge spiraled into a larger conspiracy, revealing a sophisticated operation to use unsuspecting individuals for experimental purposes. The virus she had contracted, initially believed to be a curse, became a tool of manipulation in the hands of those who had control over her fate. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the teachers were not merely victims of an angry teenager, but part of a much larger and more sinister web. The medical facility that had been experimenting on individuals under the guise of providing treatments had far-reaching connections. Their ability to operate in secrecy, using human lives as subjects in their unethical experiments, opened up a chilling conversation about the lengths to which some will go to protect their secrets. In the end, Xiaodan's actions, though severe, were the result of years of feeling helpless and unseen. Her retaliation became a means of reclaiming her autonomy, but it also uncovered the horrifying reality of human experimentation and the consequences of a broken system that allowed such atrocities to occur without oversight. Though Xiaodan's future remains uncertain, with powerful individuals likely seeking to silence her, her story serves as a stark reminder of the importance of ethics in medical and educational institutions. It calls for a closer examination of the systems that allow for abuse of power and a recognition that the impact of such abuse is not confined to the immediate victims. The ripple effect can be felt far beyond, touching everyone in its wake. The case remains open, and investigators continue to uncover more details, hoping to bring justice to those affected and ensure that such horrors are never allowed to repeat. Want to keep up with the truth, uncover hidden conspiracies, and dive deeper into the most shocking real-life thrillers? Hit subscribe now and never miss an update.